All right, so, with your philosophical mind, I figured today we could dive into a Renaissance thinker you might find pretty interesting, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. His works really grapple with some profound uh, philosophical and theological questions.
Yes, Pico's a really, really fascinating figure. We'll be exploring his life, his ideas. He was a remarkably original philosopher during the Renaissance.
Now, you might not know his name right off the bat, especially when you compare him to someone like Erasmus or Machiavelli or Thomas More, those big names.
And that's kind of the interesting thing about him, right? He was so dedicated to philosophy. I mean, really dedicated to it, as it was understood in his time, of course.
Yeah, and yet he's kind of, still sort of on the edges of the philosophical canon, at least in the English-speaking world.
Right, and our source notes that his writing style was very esoteric, like persistently esoteric, even aggressively recondite. Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, that could be it. It's important to remember the Renaissance was a totally different intellectual landscape. I mean, totally different from what we're used to.
Yeah, and Pico, he had these really huge ambitions. He tried to synthesize, to bring together all these different intellectual traditions. I mean, it was almost audacious, the scope of what he was trying to do.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today, right? We're going to look at how he tried to weave together all these different, sometimes totally opposing schools of thought.
And we'll see how his ideas sparked all sorts of controversy, particularly his 900 conclusions, and of course, you can't forget that speech, the one that's known as the Oration on the Dignity of Man.
Oh, yeah, that one. So, to get started, where should we begin with this Pico fella? Who was he? Where did he come from? And what was the beginning of his intellectual journey like?
So Pico was born back in 1463 to a noble Italian family. When he was around 14, he started studying church law in Bologna. But as happens, his interests shifted.
So not a lawyer then.
It seems not. Within a couple of years, he was all about philosophy. He moved first to Ferrara and then on to Padua.
And I think it was in Padua where he met someone who really influenced them, right?
That's right. In Padua, he met Elia de Medigo. Elia de Medigo was an Aristotelian philosopher, and he really followed the interpretations of Averroes. Averroes was a super important medieval Islamic thinker.
Oh, wow. Okay, so Averroes, an Islamic scholar, influencing a Renaissance Italian philosopher via this Elia de Medigo guy.
Exactly. It's all connected. So that early exposure to Aristotelianism was really important for Pico. But even by the time he left Padua around 1482, he was already gravitating towards Platonism, and that was being revived big time in Florence by Marsilio Ficino.
Ficino. So even back then we had that philosophical tension, huh? Aristotle versus Plato, and then Florence, that's where you went next.
Yep. By 1484, he was writing letters to these big Florentine figures, Angelo Poliziano, Lorenzo de' Medici, so we know he was involved in those intellectual circles. And then he traveled to Paris in 1485.
Paris, of course. Always a center of intellectual stuff.
Exactly. And back then, Paris was still really buzzing with these debates between nominalists and realists, all part of the Aristotelian scholastic tradition, you see.
Nominalists and realists. Refresh my memory.
Well, to put it simply, nominalism is basically the idea that universals, like concepts, are just names. They don't really exist outside of our minds. While realists, they argued that universals do exist. They have an independent existence.
Okay, right. I remember now. So Pico was right in the middle of all of it.
Right, in the thick of it. And, even before he left Italy, he'd already made his mark as a philosopher. This was when he was 22, super young. He defended philosophical Latin against these philological critics. Those critics saw it as like a corrupted form of the classical language.
Interesting. So defending the language of philosophy. Meta, right.
Exactly. And he articulated all of this in a letter to Ermolao Barbaro. He was this renowned Venetian scholar.
Right.
It shows you how Pico could use his literary skills, his talent for philosophy.
Yeah, a philosopher through and through. Now, his life wasn't all just dusty books and debates, right?
Yeah.
Our source mentions something happening in Arezzo.
Oh, yeah, Arezzo. Well, let's just say he caused a bit of a scandal there. He abducted this young woman. The thing is, she was already married to Giuliano Mariotto de' Medici, no less.
Oh, wow. Straight into Medici family drama.
Yep. Though, to be fair, he did get some support from Lorenzo de' Medici, a more powerful cousin, But yeah, between the abduction and then a plague breaking out, Pico had to keep moving around.
Talk about a chaotic time. So amidst all this drama,
Yeah.
his intellectual ambitions were brewing, right? This whole idea of philosophical harmony is taking shape.
You got it. Even while he was working on a commentary for a friend's love poem, written in Italian, he was already thinking about a much bigger project. He wanted to reconcile, to find a way to bring together all the different and sometimes fighting parts of philosophy.
That's a big goal.
It is. Initially, he was focused on the harmony he saw between the Platonists and the Aristotelians. Under the surface, they weren't so different, he thought. But that idea of concordia, that's what he called it, it grew into this much, much bigger ambition.
Okay, so it wasn't just Plato versus Aristotle anymore.
Nope. It became this global thing. He wanted to create a unified system that included every single school of thought, like all the philosophers from every time period, past, present, everything.
Wow, talk about shooting for the moon. And then he takes this crazy idea and decides to host this big public debate in Rome. And that's where the 900 conclusions come in, right?
Right. So to get people's attention, to really get people talking about this massive project of his, Pico decided he was going to sponsor this huge conference in Rome. This was planned for early 1487.
I can only imagine.
And to prepare for this, he put together 900 propositions. 900. And he drew those propositions from just a vast, vast range of authorities. Ancient, medieval, pagan, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, you name it. It was like he was throwing down a gauntlet, challenging everyone to debate with him publicly.
900 propositions. That's wild. So these propositions, they were collected and published, and that's what we know as the conclusions, right? And those were printed in Rome at the end of 1486.
Right. And get this, he also wrote a speech to go along with these conclusions as an introduction. But he never ended up delivering it, and he never published it either. It wasn't until after he died in 1494 that other people found it and gave it the title we know it by today. Oration on the Dignity of Man.
So the title wasn't even his.
Nope. Pico himself, he never gave it a title.
So the work he's most famous for is actually based on a speech he never gave. And it has a title that was given to it after he died, and it was meant to introduce these 900 crazy debate topics.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Okay, so what about the conclusions themselves? How are they structured?
Well, the pamphlet, the published version, it had two main parts. The first part had 402 theses. Those were attributed to different authorities, all kinds of big names, people like Albert the Great, Aquinas, Ibn Rushd, Plotinus, even Jewish Kabbalists.
Got it. And the second part?
The second part had 498 theses, and these were where Pico really laid out his own ambitions, his own ideas, on topics like Concord, dissent, Platonism, magic, Christian Kabbalah, the whole shebang.
Okay, so he's showing off his research, but also throwing in his own 2 cents. And, of course, these conclusions, they didn't exactly fly under the radar, did they?
Oh, no, not at all. They stirred up a lot of controversy. I mean, a lot. There were some theological novelties in there that really got people riled up, especially this one claim. He said magic and Kabbalah could actually prove the divinity of Christ.
Whoa, hold on. Remind me, what's Christology again? And Trinitarian theology. I know I should know this.
Of course, of course. Christology, that's basically the branch of theology that focuses on the nature of Jesus Christ, who he was, what it means for him to be both God and human. And Trinitarian theology, that deals with the doctrine of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all being one God.
Right. The Trinity. Okay, got it. So Pico is making some pretty bold claims about magic and Kabbalah being connected to all that.
Yep. And those claims, along with some other propositions, they caught the attention of the church. Pope Innocent VIII himself stepped in and actually condemned 13 of Pico's theses.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal.
Right. And then a papal commission took a closer look at the conclusions, and they declared some of them suspicious and others just flat out condemned.
So Pico's big plan, his big intellectual project, it hit a major roadblock. And how did he respond to all of this?
So Pico wrote this thing called the Apology. It was supposed to be a defense of the theses that had been condemned.
Sounds reasonable. Clear the air, smooth things over.
Well, unfortunately, the Apology ended up provoking Pope Innocent even more. He ended up denouncing the whole collection, all 900 propositions.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah. Pico ended up in disgrace. He had to flee Italy and even ended up being imprisoned in France for a short time because the Pope asked for it. And of course, that big conference he was planning, it was canceled.
What a mess. Well, let's try to shift gears a bit. Let's go back to one of the core ideas behind this whole ambitious project, that idea of philosophical harmony, or concordia, as he called it. What exactly was he thinking with all that?
Okay, so Pico really believed that there was a kind of underlying harmony between all these different philosophical traditions, even when they seemed to be in conflict. And he didn't just see it with Aristotle and Plato, he saw it everywhere. Between Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, between Aquinas and Scotus, all over.
So under all the disagreements, there's this secret unity, this harmony. Kind of beautiful when you think about it. But was this a completely new idea? Was Pico the first one to think of this?
Well, the idea of harmony itself wasn't totally new. Like, even ancient commentators on Plato and Aristotle, they had similar views. They saw connections and unity between those two giants.
Right, right.
And there was this guy, Simplicius of Cilicia. He was a Platonist from the 6th century, and Pico knew about his work. Simplicius had written about how you have to look beyond the literal words, to find the underlying agreement between Plato and Aristotle.
So Pico was drawing on some older ideas, but taking them to a whole new level. But our source also suggests that maybe Pico wasn't always perfectly faithful to the views of the philosophers he was citing in the conclusions.
That's a really good point, and it's something any philosopher needs to keep in mind when they're studying Pico. Being totally accurate and faithful to the original sources, that wasn't always his top priority.
Okay, I see.
His main goal, especially in the context of this big debate he was planning, was to win. He wanted to pick propositions that he knew he could defend well or attack effectively, and he wasn't afraid to frame them in ways that would help him win the argument. So, a thesis he attributes to Aquinas or Averroes, it might not actually be a totally accurate reflection of what they believed.
So he was playing the game, so to speak.
In a way, yeah. And to be honest, sometimes those theses might not even reflect Pico's own, deeper views on a topic.
That's interesting. So he's using historical figures, these big names, as part of his strategy. A philosopher as a debater, huh? That adds a whole other layer to how we think about the conclusions. Okay, so let's dive into the actual content of the conclusions. What were some of the major themes? What was he focused on?
Well, the conclusions were mainly focused on 3 big areas: scholastic theology, Kabbalah, and the Platonism of late antiquity. Thinkers like Plotinus and Proclus.
And together, those two, scholastic theology and Kabbalah, they made up a big chunk of the work, right?
Yeah, about 2/3.
Okay. Now, Kabbalah, that's pretty unique, especially for a Christian scholar like Pico. For those who aren't familiar, Kabbalah is a mystical way of interpreting the Hebrew Bible. It's all about uncovering hidden meanings.
Absolutely. And Pico is in a really unique position here. He's a Christian scholar who went deep, I mean deep, into Kabbalah. And he was able to do this because of his relationships with Jewish scholars, people like Flavius Mithridates and Elia del Medico. Those relationships were key.
Interesting. So he had these connections that allowed him to learn about Kabbalah.
Yep. And Pico went all in. He tried to Christianize Kabbalah. He wanted to find things within it that supported Christology and Trinitarian theology.
That's pretty bold, trying to integrate a tradition like that into Christian thought. Did people back then understand what he was doing?
Honestly, most Christian theologians back then wouldn't have understood Kabbalah at all. It would have been way over their heads. And for the few Jewish scholars who did study Kabbalah, Christian theology would have been, well, pretty horrifying to them.
So he was bridging a pretty big gap.
He was. And the conclusions, with all its technical language and the way it mixed all these different traditions that sometimes felt like they just couldn't go together, well, it probably didn't have too many readers at the time.
I see. Too esoteric, too ahead of its time. All right, let's move on to that famous speech. The one that everyone knows, even if it was never delivered.
Yeah.
The one that's called, even though Pico didn't call it that, the Oration on the Dignity of Man.
Yeah, that one. You're right, it's more well-known than the conclusions, even though it was supposed to just be an introduction. And remember, Pico never delivered it, never published it himself.
Right, right.
And it didn't become famous until much later, after he was gone. And someone else gave it that title, the Oration on the Dignity of Man.
And it's the beginning of the speech, that part about how humans can choose their own nature. That's the part that really sticks with people, especially historians.
Yeah, you're right. Especially historians who came after Kant. They see it as this big declaration of human dignity and freedom. And that interpretation, it's really shaped how we think about the Renaissance as a whole.
It's like a symbol of Renaissance humanism.
Mm.
But our source, it hints that maybe Pico had something else in mind, something different from just celebrating human dignity.
That's a crucial point. It's true. There's that theme of human potential in the speech. But when you really dig into it, Pico's ultimate goal wasn't focused on human dignity in the way Kant would have understood it. I mean, not really. His main aim was something else entirely. He wanted humans to, to transform, to become something more than human, to become angels. And he thought this could happen through a specific kind of paideia. That's Greek for like education or training, but it's more than just school. He's talking about spiritual education.
Okay, spiritual education. So not just about learning facts, it's about transforming yourself.
Exactly. And for Pico, that transformation involved philosophy, magic, and Kabbalah. And the whole point of this process was to reach a state of mystical union with God. And in that union, you transcend your individual self. You lose yourself in a way.
Whoa, that's intense. So it's not about celebrating how awesome humans are as they are. It's about becoming something else entirely, something beyond human. That's a big difference. So what were the stages of this PDA? How did he think people could achieve this transformation?
He laid out a whole progression. It started with moral philosophy, then you moved on to dialectic. After that, natural philosophy, and then theology. But it didn't stop there. He saw magic and Kabbalah as these essential tools to keep climbing higher to eventually reach that mystical union.
So magic and Kabbalah, not exactly the usual tools in modern
I
philosophy.
know, right? But for Pico, they were crucial. He saw magic as a way to propel your soul, to move it up through the celestial realms towards God. It was like a bridge between natural philosophy and natural theology.
Okay, what about Kabbalah? Where does that fit in?
Kabbalah was even higher than magic. It wasn't about words and arguments like theology. It was about taking humans who are made of body and spirit and transforming them into pure spirit. No more body, no more matter. And that's what makes you ready for henonosis. That's the Greek word for like unification with God.
So this is a really radical vision of what humans can be, huh?
Yeah.
And it all ends with, well, with the self disappearing, with becoming one with God. Okay, now besides the conclusions in the oration, Pico wrote other things too. There's the heptaplus. How does that fit into his overall project, especially with Kabbalah?
The Heptaplus is really important. He published it in 1489, and it's basically his Kabbalistic commentary on the first 26 verses of Genesis.
The creation stories.
Yep, the creation story. And it shows you how deeply he was engaging with Kabbalah at this point. He was really relying on the knowledge he had learned from Jewish Kabbalists. And some scholars think he wrote the Heptaplus as a way to present a Christianized version of Kabbalah, to make it more acceptable, less controversial than what he had done in the conclusions.
So maybe a more toned down version. Okay, our source mentions these different layers of meaning in Scripture, the literal meaning, the allegorical, the tropological, and the anagogical. Can you remind me what those are again?
Sure. So the literal meaning, that's the surface level, what the words say directly. The allegorical meaning, that's the symbolic meaning, what the story represents. The tropological meaning, those are the moral lessons you can learn from it. And the anagogical meaning, that's about spiritual truths, truths that lead you to a higher understanding.
Right, okay, those four levels. Thanks for the reminder. So how did Pico work with those in the heptaplus?
He acknowledged those traditional four levels for sure, but he added a new type of allegory. And this one came from the very structure of creation, how the universe is built. And this new allegory, it pointed towards a new kind of anagogy, an anagogy that's all about mystical ascent, climbing up to God through Kabbalah.
So he's taking the creation story and looking at it through this Kabbalistic lens. And the source also mentions something about the structure of the heptaplus itself and this idea of the 49 gates of understanding. It says it's related to the Sephiro in Kabbalah.
Yeah, that's right. The
Yeah.
Sephiro, those are like the 10 emanations of God in Kabbalistic thought. And Pico, he was making this subtle connection to the idea that Moses, when he went up Mount Sinai, he passed through 49 gates of understanding to reach the 50th gate. That 50th gate, that was the ultimate portal to union with God.
Okay, I'm following. 49 gates, then the final 50th gate.
Exactly. And each of those gates, they represent these different Sephirotic stations. And Pico was suggesting that the whole universe, everything that exists, it's also a universe of understanding. It's like a map that can guide you to mystical union with God. And he hid all these clues in the Heptaplus. The book has 7 sections, and his analysis of the Hebrew letters of Bereshit, that's in the beginning in Hebrew, it was all connected to this idea of the 49 gates. But to be honest, most Christian readers at the time probably would have had a clue what he was talking about.
Sounds pretty obscure.
It was. Deliberately so, I think. Our source says Pico believed that if you explain holy wisdom too plainly, you'd be, defiling it.
So you had to be in the know to understand.
Exactly. Pico thought that the deepest spiritual truths, you could only grasp them if you were part of this intellectual elite, this group of people who could decipher his allegories and hidden messages. That's why his Kabbalistic writings are so often obscure, so hard to understand. He wanted it that way.
So beyond Kabbalah, Pico also wrote about other areas of philosophy, right? Like astrology. I'm thinking of his disputations against astrology.
Yeah, that was another major work, even though it's unfinished. In the disputations, Pico was basically arguing against astrology. And he drew on all these objections that had been raised against it, going all the way back to ancient and medieval times. He even used this philological approach, which means he looked closely at the language of astrological texts, their meaning and interpretation.
So he was being a critical scholar, looking at the evidence.
He was. He questioned whether astrology could actually predict the future accurately. He argued that the influence of the stars, the planets, all that, it was just too broad, too general to give you specific, reliable knowledge about the future.
That makes sense. And he also tackled those big metaphysical questions, right? With that fragment called On Being and the One.
That's right. In On Being and the One, Pico took sides with Aristotle. He was against the Platonic idea of separating being and the one. Plato thought that the one, this ultimate source of everything, was higher than being itself.
Okay.
But Pico, he disagreed with that. And this actually goes against what Marsilio Ficino, that Florentine Platonist we talked about earlier, believed.
Interesting. So he's challenging Ficino directly.
He is, and it shows you that Pico wasn't just trying to blindly harmonize everything, to blend all these traditions together without thinking critically. He had his own ideas, his own arguments.
Yeah, he was a real philosopher wrestling with these complex issues.
Yeah.
Okay, so given all of his work, all his ideas, all the controversy, what was his reputation like, both during his lifetime and later on?
Well, during his life, it was complicated. The whole thing with the 900 conclusions, the condemnation from the Pope, it really hurt him. Even though he had powerful friends like Lorenzo de' Medici, that papal condemnation was hard to shake off.
I can imagine.
But after he died, his nephew, Gianfrancesco Pico, he really worked to shape his uncle's image. He published his works, wrote a very pious biography. He wanted to present him in a positive light.
Makes sense. And that oration, the one he's so famous for now, it seems like it took a while for people to really appreciate it. And they didn't always get it right either.
You're absolutely right. The oration, for centuries, not that many people read it. It wasn't until much later that it gave all this attention and that idea of human dignity became associated with it. And a lot of that is due to how historians, especially those influenced by Kant, interpreted it.
So his legacy is kind of a mixed bag then.
I think so. He was brilliant, incredibly ambitious, a true figure of the Renaissance. But his drive to synthesize everything, to bring it all together, even though it was groundbreaking, it also caused a lot of problems for him. And that's probably why he's kind of been overlooked in the traditional history of philosophy, at least until recently.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into Pico, we've seen his huge ambition. He wanted to unify all these different intellectual traditions. We've talked about how he went deep into Kabbalah and how he tried to make it fit with Christianity. We've looked at that famous speech on human transformation, the oration, and how his message is often misunderstood. It's not really about celebrating how great humans are. It's about how we can transform ourselves, go beyond being human through philosophy, magic, and Kabbalah. And that all leads to mystical union with God, what they call kenosis.
Exactly. It's a lot to take in. And honestly, Pico's project, it doesn't fit neatly into the way we think about philosophy today, but it gives us a really fascinating glimpse into what intellectual life was like during the Renaissance. That time was all about this dialogue, this back and forth between philosophy, theology, and these more esoteric traditions. And maybe today we've lost sight of that a little bit.
That's a great point. And now, here's a question for you to think about. What do you make of this idea, this radical idea that Pico had, about transforming ourselves into something beyond human? How does that compare to how we think about human potential today? With all this emphasis on reason and living a good life here on Earth, is there something valuable for us even now in these radical ideas, even if they challenge everything we think we know about what it means to be human?
That's a powerful question, and one that's worth spending some time with, especially for someone like you with your philosophical background. And if anyone out there is interested in learning more about Pico, I encourage you to explore his writings, to see what he had to say for yourself. There are some great translations out there, like the ITRL editions, and there's a ton of scholarship on him too. So much to discover.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Pico della Mirandola. And until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.